Corruption in India frequently provokes public outrage. Only in January of this year, the Lokpal was forced to cancel a 5 crore rupee tender for luxury cars. Now, over 1,000 years ago, eerily similar sentiments were articulated by classical Sanskrit poets, well worth remembering today. They had a vocal skepticism of affluent bureaucrats, unscrupulous godmen, and irresponsible rulers. From the inception of Indian statecraft, political theorists were aware of the ever-present dangers of corruption. The Arthashastra recommends that all senior officials be tested by secret agents and that they be made to regularly inspect their underlings, with fines and punishments recommended for any embezzlement. Even royals were not above Kautilya's suspicion. Secret agents were supposed to report on the activities of princes and queens. Kautilya imagined a court that was kept in line by an austere and disciplined king. In fact, he goes so far as to say that a ruler who's either too lenient or too harsh would incite everyone from householders to wandering hermits to rise in revolt. In Sanskritic political thought, the merits and capabilities of the ruler were central to ensuring that the people lived in peace and prosperity. But a parallel and recurring idea is that some kings were simply not capable of rulership. Kalidasa, the great poet dramatist of the 4th to 5th century CE, depicts both types in his epic Raghuvamsam. The titular dynasty of Raghu is established by vigorous conquerors, but it ends in ignominy thanks to Agnivarma, a distant descendant of the god king Ram, who behaves like the classical political Nepo baby, and I quote, plunged in sensual pleasure, reckoning not of a royal duty. End quote. Now, what applied to the king applied more generally to the medieval courtly circle. In the Pada Taditaka of Syamilaka, which was roughly contemporaneous with the Raghuvamsam, so we're talking about the 4th, 5th century CE, we see a view from the bottom up. Gossip from the courtesans, a district of ancient Ujjain, related by a wandering gambler and dilettante. We hear of a pair of Brahmin brothers, one of whom is kicked on the head by a courtesan, who then rushes to the council of town Brahmins to demand justice. The other is dragged out of a brothel for, and I quote, a dispute with a barbarian stableman until he is rescued by a general who works for his brother-in-law. Now, whether or not these were true stories, clearly Sanskrit dramatists knew that the rich and powerful of ancient India could escape sticky situations through their family connections. Sound familiar? Medieval Indian kingdoms, much like the Indian state today, suffered from severe limitations in capacity. Local officials of various ranks could easily collude. Now, a really nasty example is narrated in the Yashastilaka, which is a 10th century Sanskrit epic by the Deccan Jain teacher Somadeva Suri. In Book 3 of the Yashastilaka, a spy dressed as a mendicant, and I quote, with a crown of peacock feathers surmounted by a crescent, a necklace made out of magic roots, a garland made of old rags, and upper arms decorated with bracelets of tin balls, and forearms enveloped with buffalo horn, end quote, gives the king a report of a minister who is completely out of control, quote, a monster of financial corruption, end quote. He forces cultivators into unpaid work. He demands taxes before the harvest. He allows troops to move during the harvest. On top of it all, he had stolen land grants to temples and Brahmins, melted down sacred bronzes, and replaced them with cheap imitations. But all of this pales in comparison to the picture of apathy, corruption, and violence painted by the Kashmiri Pandit Kshemendra, active in the 11th century at a time of great cultural change. Brilliant poets and aestheticians hobnobbed with pugilistic provincial warlords and ruthless kings, some of whom did actually melt down idols in order to fund armies. Kshemendra's Narmamala is without competition the most excoriating indictment of Indian bureaucracy ever written. In contrast to most Sanskrit works which begin with a prayer to a god, Kshemendra instead begins the Narmamala with, and I quote, victory to that Lord Supreme, that illustrious bureaucrat, infallible, who can at will delude the whole world with deceptions. End quote. Kshemendra then proceeds to narrate a legendary origin for the bureaucrat. The term uses is Kayasth, but this was before Kayas had been organized as an endogamous caste. After the god Vishnu destroyed the demons, we are told, the chief demon accountant prayed to Kali, the chaotic deity of the end times. Kali blessed this accountant with a great weapon, a pen, whose, quote, black ink will engulf everything and accomplish all your objectives, end quote. Then, as the descendants of this accountant spread out over the earth, Kali dances, quote, dressed in birch bark documents with scissors to trim them in hand, writing on the sky with an ink-filled pen, a briefcase under his arm, end quote. Now, the Narmamala seems to have been written after Kshemendra had a run-in with a bureaucratic clique who then serve as a narrative device for him to pour scorn on the immorality of society more broadly. Visible throughout the narrative is how the delicate checks and balances and tests and informers of the Arthashastra could easily be subverted through collusion, greed, and apathy. In the Narmamala, far from reporting on corruption, bureaucrats use spies to oppress the people and identify easy targets. The poet describes an entire chain of avarice. The king's head of domestic affairs is tipped off about a wealthy temple to which he appoints a corrupt caretaker. This man lets soldiers loose on the temple's tenants, including homemakers and children. Next, an official scribe joins the clique to issue even more taxation orders with the collusion of a treasury officer who inflates the revenue estimates and appoints puppets to the temple board. Next, a village officer described, and I quote, as the progeny of a ordure-filled hell, end quote, arrives on the scene and purloins fineries from the entire village in the name of gifts, all while hypocritically, and I quote, bowing to the Brahmins circumambulating the cows, end quote. The villagers flee only to be further punished with eerily contemporary measures. Quoting from the bureaucrat, confiscate, arrest, imprison, destroy the house. End quote. The story continues, mutating further and further as more vulture-like characters are introduced. The village officer's young wife is seduced by local libertines. The officer seeks advice from a corrupt godman who is ridiculously obese with disreputable followers. Surgeons, courtesans, astrologers, secretaries, and clerks all beg the guru for financial opportunities. The situation is only resolved when the first link in the chain, the king's head of domestic affairs, runs away with his ill-gotten fortune. Then, finally, the king turns his wrath on the rest of the clique, persecuting everyone until the village officer finally dies as a beggar in a sewer of excrement. Now, reading this text from over 1,000 years ago, you have to ask yourself, what would the great satirists of the Sanskrit tradition make of corruption, unjust punishment, and the nexus of crime and charlatans and bureaucratic and accountability today?